All right, let's jump right into our deep dive today. We're going to be looking at migrating from VMware to Proxmox, and we've got this great document, Top Gotchas, when moving from VMware to Proxmox, and
Uh,
that's going to be our roadmap today. So think of this as like, getting ready for a road trip. We're going to make sure we've got everything packed, we've got our snacks, we've got our map, so we don't run into any unexpected detours.
yeah, exactly. It's really common for folks to think that moving between these platforms is just,
Yeah.
just pick up your VMs and plop them down in the new spot. But VMware and Proxmox, even though they're both really powerful for virtualization, they have some pretty big differences under the hood.
Yeah.
And those can really trip you up if you're not prepared.
Yeah, and speaking of things that can trip you up, one of the first things that jumped out at me in this document was about virtualization tools. I think, like a lot of people, I just kind of assumed VMware tools would work everywhere.
Right, I mean, it makes sense.
Yeah.
But actually, Proxmox uses something called qemu-guest-tools. They're kind of the equivalent of VMware tools, but specifically designed for Proxmox.
So does that mean if you don't install those qemu-guest tools, your VMs are just like not going to work right?
Well, they might work, but you're probably going to see some performance issues. And you could be missing out on some key features, too. It's kind of like trying to run a Windows program on a Mac without the right compatibility layer.
So first thing after migrating, install those qemu-guest tools, right?
Definitely. Think of it as like step one in your Proxmox setup checklist.
Got it. Noted. Okay, so moving on, let's talk about auto start. I feel like this is one of those things you don't really think about until it goes wrong. You just assume your VMs are going to boot up when the server restarts.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And in VMware, it usually works pretty seamlessly. But Proxmox handles it a little differently. The setting to make sure your VMs boot up automatically, it's kind of tucked away in the UI under Start at Boot.
Okay, so not exactly where you'd expect to find it.
Right. And it's super important to double-check this setting for each VM after you migrate, especially if this is a production environment.
Yeah, I can imagine that's a pretty unpleasant surprise if your server reboots and suddenly your critical VMs are just sitting there offline.
Exactly. Not a good look.
All right, snapshots. So this seems like a big one. In VMware, they're generally pretty straightforward, but Proxmox, it sounds like there are some interesting quirks we need to be aware of.
Yeah, the main thing is storage compatibility. Proxmox snapshots, they actually depend on the type of storage you're using. Some storage types work really well with snapshots, others not so much.
So if you're someone who uses snapshots a lot in VMware, you really need to think about your storage strategy in Proxmox.
Absolutely. It's not just about moving the VMs themselves. It's also about making sure your storage infrastructure is going to play nice with Proxmox's way of doing things.
Makes sense. So what storage would you recommend for Proxmox if you're using a lot of snapshots?
ZFS is usually a good choice. It's well suited for handling snapshots efficiently.
Got it. ZFS for snapshots. Okay, performance. Everyone wants their VMs to be fast, right? So what are some of the key things to keep in mind when we're moving from VMware to Proxmox to make sure we don't see any performance hits?
Well, one of the biggest factors is using VirtIO drivers.
VirtIO, I've heard that term thrown around, but can you explain what it is and why it's so important?
Sure. So basically, VirtIO drivers are specifically designed for virtualized environments. They kind of provide a more direct and efficient way for the VM to communicate with the host hardware.
So it's like you're removing some of the bottleneck?
Exactly. You're streamlining the flow of data.
Okay, and these VirtIO drivers, are they for both network and storage?
Yeah, you want to use them for both.
All right, so VirtIO check. Anything else we should be thinking about for performance?
Yeah, especially if you have VMs that handle a lot of traffic, like database servers. It can be helpful to match the number of network queues to the number of vCPUs.
Okay, so that's a more advanced tweak.
Right, but it can make a big difference for high-traffic VMs.
Got it, good to know. All right, let's talk about maintenance mode. I've heard that Proxmox handles this a bit differently than VMware, and it can be a bit trickier.
Yeah, in VMware, when you put a host into maintenance mode, it usually automatically moves the VMs to other hosts, so there's no downtime.
Right, that's pretty handy.
Proxmox doesn't have that same automated functionality.
So you have to do it manually.
Basically, yeah. You need to either migrate the VMs off the host yourself or shut them down before you take the host offline.
So that's definitely something to be aware of. You need to plan carefully to avoid any service interruptions.
Definitely. It's not something you want to rush into.
All right, so we've talked about virtualization tools, auto start, snapshots, performance, and maintenance mode. What's next on our list of things to watch out for?
Well, let's talk about compatibility, specifically making sure your existing VMs are going to play nice in their new Proxmox home.
Yeah, good point. We've already talked about VirtIO for performance. But are there any other compatibility gotchas we should be aware of?
One thing to keep in mind is CPU compatibility.
Oh, right, because VMware and Proxmox might handle CPU features differently.
Exactly, so you need to pay close attention to things like NUMA settings.
No MA
Yeah,
settings.
it stands
Hmm.
for non-uniform memory access. It basically controls how VMs access memory across multiple physical CPUs.
Hmm.
And you also need to be careful with CPU masking.
Which is?
It lets you limit the CPUs that a VM can use.
So you need to make sure all those settings are configured correctly in Proxmox.
Right, otherwise you could run into performance problems or even VMs crashing.
Okay, CPU compatibility, check. Last but not least, backups. Gotta have a good backup strategy no matter what platform you're using.
Absolutely, and Proxmox has its own solution called Proxmox Backup Server, or
Ah,
PBS.
okay.
It's efficient and it's designed specifically for Proxmox, but it might not have all the bells and whistles of some of the more mature backup solutions you might be used to with VMware.
So it's a good tool, but it might require some adjustments to your backup workflow.
Right. And one thing to note is that some backup operations in PBS, like taking VM snapshots, they might cause a brief interruption to the VM service.
So you might see a little bit of downtime during backups.
Yeah, it's something to factor in, especially if you're used to non-disruptive backups in VMware.
All right. That's a good point to be aware of. Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive. Virtualization tools, auto start, snapshots, performance, maintenance mode, compatibility, and backups. That's a lot to think about.
It is, but hopefully this gives you a good starting point and helps you avoid some of the common pitfalls when moving from VMware to Proxmox.
For sure. And we're not done yet. We've got a lot more to explore in the next part of our deep dive, so stay tuned.
Looking forward to it.
Welcome back to our deep dive on migrating from VMware to Proxmox. Last time we talked about some of the general gotchas you might run into, but now I kind of want to dig into some more specific areas. And I think networking is a good place to start because, without networking, your VMs are basically stranded islands.
Yeah, networking is definitely critical. And it's another area where Proxmox does things a little differently than VMware.
So let's say we've migrated our VMs, we boot them up in Proxmox, and suddenly they can't talk to the network. What's the first thing we should be checking?
Well, one of the most common issues is the network bridge configuration.
Network bridge, okay.
Yeah, so in VMware, you usually create virtual switches,
Right?
and those are mapped to the physical network adapters on the host.
Makes sense.
Proxmox uses a Linux bridge instead.
Linux bridge.
Yeah, it's basically a virtualized version of a physical network switch.
Okay, I think I'm following.
So you need to make sure this bridge is set up correctly.
What kind of things should we be looking at
Well, first you want to check the IP address and subnet mask assigned to the bridge.
to make sure it matches our network?
Exactly. And in some cases, you might need to create multiple bridges. For example, if you're using VLANs or different network segments.
So this is probably where some familiarity with the Proxmox command line comes in handy.
Yeah, the web UI is good for basic configuration. But for more advanced networking stuff, you'll probably need to use the command line.
Got it. So we've got our network bridge sorted out. Now let's zoom in on the virtual network adapters within the VMs themselves. We talked about VirtIO drivers before. Are there any other networking considerations specific to the VMs when we're moving to Proxmox?
One thing to be aware of is that Proxmox doesn't support the VMXNet3 network adapter.
Which is?
It's a type of virtual network adapter that's commonly used in VMware.
Okay.
It's known for its good performance and features.
But Proxmox doesn't play nice with it.
Right, so you want to switch those VMs over to VirtIO network adapters.
VirtIO, again, seems like a good all-around choice for Proxmox.
It is. It usually offers the best performance and compatibility.
Okay, networking, check. Now let's move on to security.
Always important.
Yeah, because we want to make sure our virtualized environment is just as secure in Proxmox as it was in VMware.
Absolutely.
So are there any specific security gotchas we should be aware of when making this transition?
Well, one area where the two platforms differ quite a bit is user permissions and role management.
Oh.
VMware has a very granular permission system.
So you can really fine-tune who has access to what.
Exactly. Proxmox's role-based access control is a little more streamlined.
So maybe not quite as much flexibility?
Right, you might not be able to replicate the exact same permission structure you had in VMware.
But you can still create a secure environment.
Definitely, it just might require a slightly different approach.
Got it. So user permissions, something to keep in mind. What about firewalls? How do we protect our VMs from, the bad guys out there on the network?
Proxmox has a built-in firewall. It uses Linux IPTables.
IPTables.
Yeah, it's a very powerful and flexible framework for controlling network traffic.
but maybe not the most user-friendly for people coming from VMware.
That's true. It's very command line oriented.
So if you're used to a more graphical firewall management experience,
It might be a bit of a learning curve.
makes sense. All right, we've talked about networking and security. Now let's tackle storage, which is always a fun topic.
Always lots of interesting nuances when it comes to storage.
We already touched on it a bit when we talked about snapshots, but I'm sure there's more to unpack.
Yeah, for starters, Proxmox doesn't natively support the VMFS file system.
Which is?
It's the standard file system used by VMware ESX hosts.
So if we're migrating VMs from a VMware environment, we can't just copy the virtual disks over to Proxmox.
Not directly, no. You'll need to convert them to a format that Proxmox understands.
What are our options there?
Well, Proxmox supports a few different formats: LVM, ZFS, Ceph, GlusterFS.
Quite a few choices.
Yeah, and each one has its pros and cons,
Okay.
so you'll need to choose the one that best fits your needs.
Sounds like storage migration requires some careful planning.
It does. You need to think about the storage format, the conversion process, and how you're going to set everything up on the Proxmox side.
And probably more command line fun.
It's likely, especially if you're using more advanced storage solutions like Ceph or GlusterFS.
All right, so we've covered networking, security, and storage in this part of our deep dive. That's a lot of information to digest.
It is, but hopefully it gives you a better understanding of some of the key differences between VMware and Proxmox.
For sure, and it highlights the importance of doing your homework before you jump into a migration.
Absolutely. The more prepared you are, the smoother the transition will be.
Welcome back to our deep dive. We're on the final stretch now, exploring the world of Proxmox. And, in VMware, we might be used to having things like DRS, Distributed Resource Scheduler, to kind of automatically keep our VMs humming along, make sure they've got the resources they need. So what happens in Proxmox? Do we have something similar?
Proxmox doesn't have an exact equivalent of DRS, but you still have a lot of control over how our resources are allocated.
Okay, so more of a manual approach.
Yeah, you can use things like CPU affinity.
CPU affinity, what's that?
Basically, it lets you tell specific VMs to use specific CPU cores.
Oh, interesting.
And there's also memory ballooning.
Memory ballooning.
Yeah, it's a way to dynamically adjust how much memory a VM is using.
So it's like giving them a little extra breathing room if they need it.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got these tools to manage resources, but how do we know if our VMs are actually performing well? In VMware, there are all sorts of fancy dashboards and graphs.
Proxmox has its own monitoring tools built in.
Oh, okay, so we're not flying blind?
No, not at all. You can see things like CPU usage, memory consumption, network traffic, disk I/O.
All that good stuff. And is that all accessible through the web interface?
Yep, you can see it all there. And if you want even more detailed info, you can use command line tools.
All right, so we've got ways to monitor performance. But let's face it, even with the best planning, sometimes things just go wrong, and we need to troubleshoot.
Happens to the best of us.
So what's troubleshooting like in Proxmox compared to VMware?
Well, with Proxmox, you're often going to be digging a little deeper. You'll be looking at log files, using command line tools, maybe even asking for help on the Proxmox forums.
So a bit more hands-on.
Yeah, and having a good understanding of Linux will definitely come in handy.
But even if you're not a Linux guru, there are resources available.
Exactly. The Proxmox community is really helpful.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. I feel like we've really explored the ins and outs of migrating from VMware to Proxmox.
We have, and hopefully it's given you a better understanding of what to expect.
For sure. I think the key takeaway is that Proxmox is a powerful platform, but it does require a different way of thinking.
Absolutely. It's not just a drop-in replacement for VMware.
You need to be prepared to learn new things, embrace the command line.
And don't be afraid to experiment and ask for help.
Yeah, the Proxmox community is a great resource. So to everyone out there thinking about making the switch, do your research, be prepared to learn, and don't be afraid to dive in.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
All right, that's it for our deep dive today. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep exploring.